Welcome back to my channel. My name is Dr. Anwar Youssef Dunbar, and this is Big Discussions 76, my original channel. Please like this video, please share it, and please subscribe. Well, I am back with another guest. This one I particularly hold in very, very high esteem. Joining me this time, he's laughing. Joining me this time is Dr. Ralph Perrino. Ralph, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here, Anwar. Thanks for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Okay, so I say now that this channel right now is focused on general topics, money, financial literacy, which is something that's near and dear to my heart, current events, personal thoughts of the day, and education. Because education is something that's near and dear to my heart and something that's impacted my life and my life story. Dr. Perrino is an educational veteran, and so we're going to talk about his experiences in education throughout his career in this particular interview. But as with most guests who are on for the first time, I like to open up with how we met and how we got to know each other for context. By the way, I just mentioned what this channel is dedicated to. There's also a sports channel for those of you who are interested in that. And there's a science and technology channel as well. Speaking of which, I'm hoping to have a discussion with Ralph's son, Raphael, who is a bit of a rock star in the astronomy and astrophysics space, and
maybe a rocket
star. A rocket star. And I mean, and all this goes together. That Raphael, me and Ralph, there's a story about how we all met as well. And I have an entertainment and media channel where I cover things like movies and shows and those kinds of things. So there are other Big Discussions channels if you're interested in that. But
and by the way, if I could just interrupt real quickly, if you don't mind, there's a strong link between Raphael being involved with the aerospace industry and education and parenting. So maybe we could talk about that later on.
Yep, all of this is gonna
all comes together.
Yes. So Ralph, so in terms of how we met, for those of you who don't know, I did some tutoring. I have a pharmacology and toxicology background, and I have a 9-to-5 right now. And there was a point at which, well, actually, I'm always thinking about how to hustle up extra money and extra cash, and just also building my network. And so about 8 years ago, I had to think about how to make some extra money. And so I had a light bulb moment one day, and I said, you know what? I have basically a background in general biology, chemistry, and a little bit of physics. And I said, well, I can tutor. So I literally went into Google and typed in tutoring services, Northern Virginia, and the Northern Virginia tutoring service came up. And that was the service created and run by you, Ralph.
Yep, for 24 and a half years.
So I, looked at the list of requirements for tutors, and then I reached out to Ralph, and I came over to your office, and you interviewed me. I think it might have been on my lunch break or something like that. And from that point
I interviewed everybody in person, face to face. We'll talk about that later too.
Okay. And so from that point on, I worked in your service for the next 2 to 3 years, maybe 4.
More than that, I think.
Sorry?
It was 5. It was at least 5 or 6 years, I'm sure.
6 years. Yeah. So tutoring kids in Northern Virginia, going to homes. So I got a lot of tutoring and teaching experience that I thought I never thought that I would do something like that. And it turned out to
You did a great job. You were a natural.
Thanks, Ralph. It turned out to be a lot of fun. And I learned a lot, in addition to creating an extra income stream. And so I did that, and we collaborated there. And then you recommended me to be a board member of the Friends of the Arlington Planetarium.
Yep.
And so it turned out that there is a planetarium here in Northern Virginia, right next to Washington Lee High School over in Arlington.
The only freestanding planetarium in the area.
The only freestanding planetarium in the area. And that's probably one of the few remaining in the country, right?
Sure, yeah. It was built in 1968 or 67 in response to the space race, the height of the space race. You know, it was politically charged, but yeah, it's there for that reason, no doubt about it.
And it's named after David M. Brown. So again, for the next 5 to 6 years, I became a board member and helped out with that effort. Learned a lot about astronomy and astrophysics and aerospace. And at that point, I started writing for examiner.com.
That's right. I remember that.
And the Friends of the Planetarium, that gave me an article to write up for them every single month, because we had to write an article for them to keep current and to keep our standing with that publication. So that gave me a science article to write every month, in addition to meeting other individuals in the community who were interested in the sciences. And that turned out to be a very fruitful collaboration. And just lastly, Ralph, you became you became a mentor. You know, there are times when we sat and talked at Joe's
Pizza and Pasta, yeah.
Yep, Joe's Pizza and Pasta, about education and life and family. And I've definitely...
God, you're making me feel old.
Just it just is what it is. And so I've learned a lot from you on all fronts from our many discussions. And so I just want to thank you at this point for everything you've added to my life.
My pleasure.
So it turns out, Ralph, that Ralph is a retired educator, a recently retired educator. I'll let him tell us some more about that. But I asked Ralph, I thought that it would be cool to talk about how the education landscape changed from when you started in your career versus to when you recently retired. I know that's very open-ended. We can go in any number of directions there. I know one area we've talked about a lot is the technology aspect. And we actually collaborated on a piece on my blogging platform about how technology has, in some ways, negatively influenced or impacted our civilization and society. But I'm gonna get out of the way, Ralph. You can let us know some of your insights there. I'll probably jump in and ask for some clarification questions as we go along. But I'll pass the mic over to you. How has education changed from over your career?
Well, it's a big, broad question and topic. I guess the first thing I would say is I taught sociology. And as a matter of fact, you came to my class once or twice and spoke to my students. But I taught sociology actually I taught political science, business management, and sociology, mostly sociology for 35 years as an adjunct professor. 3 of those years as full-time professor at the community college here in Northern Virginia. My background is in sociology. I've also got a master's in public administration and a doctorate in education and a master's in education. So I've got kind of a broad-based perspective on the world, education, society, and I often felt as though I brought a different perspective to the classroom than somebody who finished a PhD when they were in their late 20s, early 30s and went straight into teaching. I've owned a couple of businesses and done a lot of other things too. So, but I started teaching. I was local politics back in the early 80s, and was chief of staff to a county board member in Fairfax County. And I decided just like Anwar, I was looking for another source of income. I'd been married for 6 years, 4 or 5, maybe 6 years. And my older son, who is Raphael, who Anwar is going to interview now, he's 36 years old and working in the aerospace industry. He was about to be born, and I was looking for extra income. So I decided I would go to the community college and apply. And rather than just submitting my application and mailing it in, I went in and tried to knock on doors and meet deans and associate deans and try to sell myself. Well, the bottom line was that they hired me at the Annandale campus to teach 1 or 2 classes. And I enjoyed it. And for 35 years, I taught sociology and political science and business management. So having said all of that, in 1984, when I taught my first class in business management, and I think political science by 85, maybe 86, the demographics of colleges nationwide, but especially at Northern Virginia Community College, was very different than it is today. It was primarily middle class, upper middle class kids from Fairfax County, predominantly white. Some women, not as many as now, but you could see the percentage of women growing year to year. And of course, the influx of ethnic minorities was very different back then. It was right after the Vietnam War had fallen, the Vietnam War had ended, and Vietnam had fallen. And prior to that, I worked at Arlington Hospital as a division head and hired lots of Vietnamese and Cambodian people. And I found that when I started teaching, I had Vietnamese and Cambodian students. Many of them were first generation. So the influx of ethnic minorities back then was mostly Southeast Asian, not many African. That changed dramatically as time went on. The Vietnamese pretty much fully assimilated by the time the mid to late 90s happened. And then the demographics changed even more. I had a lot of students from West Africa in particular. I had lots of students from Sierra Leone and from Ghana and other places like that. So little by little, my classes went from probably 75% 75% Caucasian to probably 75 to 85 to almost 95% minority and women. So the demographics of college teaching changed dramatically. Of course, that affects how you teach, and especially in a sociology class, because in a sociology class, you have to have a sociological perspective. But if you have international students, you have to have an international sociological perspective, which I quickly embraced and really found it a challenge and loved it. And we would do things like international dinners and international lunches and all sorts of interactive activities to try to bring people into the fold and to get them to see how an American classroom works. So that was a major change, and we could get into more of that later on. Another thing that changed pretty significantly, it's kind of humorous actually. When I first started teaching in '84, up until probably the mid '90s, as I approached my classroom in the hallway, I would have students waiting for me outside the class, because back then they used to lock the doors. You had to have a keypad to get in. And they'd be waiting for me outside, and they'd say, "Oh, Professor Perrino, how are you?" And we'd chit chat and talk and cover the events of the day and wait for the next professor to leave before we'd go in the classroom. Well, I found that by the early 2000s, with technology coming on, that stopped. And instead of approaching students in the hallway who embraced me and talked to me and wanted to kind of interact with me, they all had technology hanging out of their ears, out of their noses, and out of their eyeballs and whatever else. Just they were disengaged. And the other thing I noticed too, this is kind of humorous to me, is that I noticed that male and female students were not even interacting anymore in the hallway or in the classroom. There was less flirting going on. There was less interaction. There was less dating, and people would sit down at their desk and be connected to technology, not even recognize anybody around them. So I found, from a sociological perspective, and this gets for any of you sociologists out there, you know what I'm talking about. This is micro-sociology, small group interaction, dyads and triads, symbolic interactionism. I found that theoretical model began to take shape more and more, because I was observing more and more how students were not interacting with each other, or how differently they were interacting with each other just 10, 15, or 20 years, certainly 30 years earlier. So that was a major change. The other thing I would say too is that the changes in demographics had an impact on how we covered the topic of culture. We always did a complete section on culture and values, societal values and personal values, and cultural transmission, values transmission, and race and ethnicity. Those two things changed dramatically, because the issue of cultural reproduction, social reproduction, and values transmission changed focus, because I had people from all around the world. So those are the three areas that I think were most changed by the 35 years I taught.
Okay. So Ralph, so in terms of the ethnic makeup of your classes, uh, the Washington D.C. area is definitely it's an international market, definitely
Absolutely.
a mixing bowl.
Yep.
Those changing demographics, was that more? Do you think that had to do with what's unique about this area, or was it changes in policy or changes
No,
in?
it was unique about this area. As a matter of fact, I used to tell my students all the time, you guys may not realize it, but you live in a bubble. If you live in Northern Virginia, if you live in the Maryland suburbs of DC, or if you live in DC itself, you really live in a bubble, because the demographic makeup of this area, other than places like New York and Chicago and LA and Miami maybe, and maybe Houston, the demographics of this area are dramatically different. On top of that, even if you compare DC to all of those other areas I just mentioned, it's still very different, because you not only have the ethnic mix, you also have a dramatic difference in educational levels and educational attainment. Arlington County, for example, this is as of 4 or 5 years ago, it probably increased. 74% of adults in Arlington County have a bachelor's degree. I think it's 71 or 72% in Fairfax County, and the median family income is 120, 130,000, versus places around the country that had nothing comparable. So there's no doubt that I used to always tell my students, you live in a bubble here. If you go to public schools in Northern Virginia, you're going to some of the best public schools in the country, maybe the world. And what you're exposed to here and what you're exposed to on this campus is very different than what you might be exposed to if you move to get a job in Wichita Falls, Texas in 2 years. So that I think it's a function of the area, and I think it's a function of education.
Yeah.
I used to always ask the first day of class, I would ask my students, who plans to be a nurse? Because I had a lot of nursing students. And 4 or 5 or 6 hands went up, and I would always say to them, you're going to be a better nurse by taking this class. And they'd say, what do you mean by that? And I'd say, well, think about this. You get your nursing degree in a couple of years from Marymount or George Mason, and you get a job in Texas or small town in Montana or small town in Mississippi, and you're dealing with a whole different demographic. And you got to deal with somebody who you might be from Saudi Arabia. You're trying to deal with somebody whose family grew up in West Texas or Southern Mississippi. You're going to have to understand their culture and their values to treat them holistically. So the demographics were very important in so many ways when it came to teaching sociology.
Yeah. So I think this might be a good place to point out your book, because I think you quote this in your book about.
Did I hold up a copy?
Sorry?
Did I hold up a copy?
Go for it. And I think you and I just. You and I have a copy of Ralph's book. That's a very insightful book regarding education and social topics as well. In the book, I believe you discuss what you just discussed. Me and you discussed that as well regarding tutoring, in terms of how many parents in Fairfax County have bachelor's degrees and how many parents in Arlington have bachelor's degrees. And it has created a very unique environment in terms of the education expectations that they have for their children. I want to note here, I want to acknowledge my father. My father is also a retired educator, and he taught in New York State's Capital District, and I stayed with him for 2.5 years before I moved here. So I got to see firsthand and hear some of the stories that some of the things that he experienced in the districts, the district he taught in. And I think he was in one of the more challenging districts. And I think that the parent involvement and the parental expectations for the child's education is definitely very significant.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep, absolutely. That's education, and it goes back to my son, Raphael, and my other son, Pietro. Both went into various areas of science. Raphael works in the aerospace industry. Pietro is a data scientist for a large consulting firm, international consulting firm. They both volunteered at the planetarium with me from the time that they were in first grade. So my philosophy, and you and I have talked about this, Anwar, my philosophy has always been, even as a young parent with young kids, if you expose your children to math and science, or anything really, but especially math and science, at a very early age, when they get into the classroom and the teacher starts talking about math and science, instead of being intimidated by it, they feel more comfortable around it. And so both of my sons not only felt comfortable around math and science, they also felt comfortable around other people because, of course, I have a degree in sociology, so they heard that from me all the time. And we raised them in a very mixed environment in South Arlington. So they came out of that experience with math and science and a sense of sociology and fairness and equanimity toward other people. And that carries with them today. And, in their jobs, they relate well to math and science, and they also relate well to people all throughout the world. So this is one big package. You cannot compartmentalize education. And that's part of the issue we face today. Everybody wants to major in IT and make $150,000 for Amazon out of college. But they're missing the point. Education is a broad-based thing. And if parents recognize that and instill that value in their child, they'll come out with a child who has a much broader education, not just training. There's a difference between training and education. So I've often believed that. My wife has also believed it. We practiced it, and I'm proud to say my two sons benefited from it, and I'm enormously proud of them. You know them already.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to elaborate on that. But before I do, going back to the tutoring and what I saw my father experience where he lived, when I went into these homes and tutored, I was impressed by how vigilant the parents were regarding their kids scoring A's on their classes and being and participating in all of their extracurricular activities and just keeping everything on the rails. I was impressed by how vigilant the parents here in Northern Virginia were. And so I'm saying that to say it's interesting in districts like that, there's more of a balance. It seems there's more of a balance between and maybe a collaboration between the parents and the faculty versus districts where the parents aren't as active or maybe aren't as vigilant. The faculty in the school has to do more.
Why wouldn't you be surprised or impressed? It's simple from a sociological perspective. It really is. From a human perspective, the parents you're talking about could afford to spend $100 an hour for tutoring. So, you're talking about parents who are middle class, upper middle class, and extremely wealthy in areas like McLean and Great Falls, where $100 an hour is a drop in the bucket for many people in the DC area. But within that area also, you have pockets of relative poverty in Southeast Fairfax and Bailey's Crossroads and other areas where there were certain zip codes where we never, ever got a client. And I was always torn. I was always conflicted by the fact that we had to charge what we did to cover our costs, but we rarely got phone calls from certain zip codes, South Arlington, Bailey's Crossroads, Southeast Fairfax. But we knew where the money was coming from. We knew where the parents were coming from. And we knew that those parents had high levels of education and they expected much out of their children. So those kids have enormous advantages, not to mention the fact they have access to computers and technology beyond what most kids can't even dream of. And in my book, I talk about the digital divide between wealthy and poor. So, even within Fairfax County in Northern Virginia, there's a divide between rich and poor. And so those parents that you're talking about, Anwar, that when you walked into their house, you saw and felt enormous support. Almost easy to do. It's almost easy to do when you're a married couple, 2 incomes, a home in suburbia, and it's just an easier process. So there's sociology in that too.
Okay. Well, you wrote an essay called Zip Code Envy. And
no, it's not called Zip Code Envy. It's titled, by the way, the name of the book is Issues, Strategies, and Concerns in Education Today. You can get it on Amazon. The title of the essay I wrote that you referred to is titled, Where Will Your Child Be Their Sophomore Year in College?
Yep.
And one of the things I talk about in that is zip code envy. And that, when you're in a certain zip code, the expectation is that you will go to college. I often used to tell my students, if you live in a household where your parents say, if you go to college, that's very different than a household where your parents say, when you go to college.
Yeah.
So there are certain zip codes in Northern Virginia where the comment or the question is, or the observation is, when you go to college. But there are plenty of zip codes in Northern Virginia where it's if you go to college. The if you go to college kids either don't go, or they very often come to the community college, where I then see them. And they've had a hard time from K through 12, and they're suddenly in a situation where they're in college. And it's one of the reasons I enjoyed teaching community college so much, was because it was a challenge. They came with all sorts of issues that I had to deal with, but there was never a dull moment. And I loved helping kids who I knew had struggled financially and education-wise and every other way to help them succeed. So, yeah, zip code envy is definitely an issue, no doubt about it. And the whole issue of where you go to college, when you go to college, and if you go to college is another issue.
Yeah. So a couple things. So as you were talking, I was thinking in some instances, and I've seen this, I'm sure you've seen it, there are some parents who aren't necessarily affluent, but they know that they have to move their kids into certain districts.
Absolutely.
So the kids can have the same chance that the other
Right.
have. We will probably come back to the digital divide. But last year, I realized my godson, they stay over in Maryland. He was a sophomore in high school. He didn't have a computer in the home. Mm-hmm. So I took some of my funds and I bought him a computer.
Good for you.
So he would have it. And it turned out that it became very, very valuable during COVID. Those things matter. My mom had the foresight to put a computer in our home very early on. But I want to go back to, just briefly, Ralph, education versus training. What's the difference? I've never thought about that.
Oh yeah, there's a huge difference. When you obtain, and I say obtain, when you obtain an education, when you work for and obtain an education, you not only walk away with a degree, you walk away with a perspective on the world and on life and on humanity that's very different than if you're simply trained. You can get trained. You can go to a training institute. You can go become an HVAC person. You could become a lot, and there's a need for that. I'm not putting it down. There's a need for technical people, and there are plenty of young people who should consider that as a career. But the difference between training and education is that when you're educated, you have a different perspective on the world. You read different books. You meet different people. You have different friends. You go to different events. Your mind is open to a wider range of perspectives. You'll spend your life, hopefully, if you're educated, you'll spend your life with a mind that's inquiring. You'll walk into a library and look at the books and say, oh my God, there's not enough time in my life to read all these books. How do I do this? I can't get enough of this. When you're trained for a reason. You're trained to do a task, whether it's to fix heating and air conditioning systems, or to do electrical work, or to do construction, or to do whatever it happens to be. And that's all good. You can make money and support a family, and it's perfect for a lot of people. But there is a difference between training and education. And for those who have an inquiring mind and whose parents want them to have an inquiring mind, or have already instilled that sense of inquisition into their mind, education is the way to go. That's why I am so concerned about, even before the pandemic hit, small liberal arts colleges throughout the country, including the one I went to in North Carolina, were in danger. Now they're really in danger. I read recently I think it was the Wall Street Journal, that upwards of 40 or 50% of small liberal arts colleges in America may go under in the next year or so. That's a tragedy. That's a tragedy. We need liberal arts in America. We don't just need trained people. The people who are going to work for Amazon at $150,000 a pop out of Arlington County, they'll make $150,000. But when they're 35 or 40 years old and they're tired of just doing technical work and they want to go into management, and they don't have an education, they've just been trained, and they can't write clearly, they can't speak at a conference, they can't speak in a conference room, they can't even they send an email without typos and grammatical errors in it. Those people are not going to get promotions. It's the people who are educated who will move on to managerial positions, who will move on to positions of authority. So training is important, but education is also important. If you can get both of them, then you're really golden. If you can get trained in an area like tech, but also get educated in all other areas of liberal arts, you'll come out a better person, a more educated person. So there's a definite difference between training and education, but selling that to parents today is extremely difficult. because in the economic environment we were in even before the virus, let alone now, it's hard to tell parents I'm going to spend 40, 50, 60, 100, $200,000 on my kids' education and hope they get employed. That's a tough sell. But my advice to parents is, I understand that thinking, but you need to think about your child 20 or 30 years from now. And that to me is the importance of seeking an education rather than just being trained.
Okay.
I feel pretty passionately about that, as you know, because I went to a liberal arts college and my background is very much liberal arts. I've got a wide range of experiences: sociology, public administration, education. So I bring a different perspective to things, and I always try to instill that in my students. Sometimes they would look at me like this guy's out of his mind. They'd roll their eyes and say, "You're nuts. I want to make a lot of money." Some of them would listen. And I hear from students, 10, 15 years later, and they're doing things that I hope they would do. And, I'm proud of them for that.
Yeah. Wow. There are any number of places we could go on from that direction. But I want to initially ask you.
And by the way, let me just say one more thing. It's easy for me to say that for middle class, upper middle class, and wealthy parents. It's much harder to say that to a parent who has, a seventh grade education and they want their child to be successful and make money and bring money home to the family, and possibly send some of that money back to a foreign country to help the family wherever that happens to be. So, I'm talking from a perspective of, a white middle class person who has had wide range of experiences. But my personal experience doesn't come from wealth, and we could talk about that a little bit too. My background, so it can be done. You can do both. You just have to work a lot harder to do it.
Yeah. Well, and I want to ask you about why the liberal arts institutions are in danger of shutting down. But I'll just say that between children and parents, sometimes there's a conflict between what I want to major in and what you should major in, because you're going to get a high paying job afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes that conflict is there.
Absolutely. And the pressure is there with, young people today they came through the the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, when they were probably in elementary or middle school, and now they're going through the pandemic, the worldwide pandemic, and another potential Great Recession. So their life has kind of been bookmarked by two economic calamities from their perspective. So it's understandable that students and parents are worried about their future and the economy because it's not as stable as it has been in the past. But that's no reason to completely throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Okay. So, Ralph, just briefly, why are liberal arts institutions in danger of shutting down in the current landscape?
Well, I think we've already touched on it. I think what liberal arts institutions offer is not what parents want for their child.
Mm-hmm.
And also, it's not what students today want for themselves. And unfortunately, in many cases, it's not what guidance counselors in high schools are directing students to, because guidance counselors are being pushed by higher level administrators and by parents to be, quote, practical and objective about their son or daughter's future. So, should you go to, tech university where you're going to be guaranteed a job, 100% employment rate, and high-paying salaries, $150,000 or more, or should you go to XYZ small liberal arts college in North Carolina or Northern Maine and not be guaranteed a job immediately out of college? It's a tough call. I went to a small college. When I got out of college, I couldn't get a job. We were in the middle of a terrible recession in the early 70s. I couldn't get a job. I worked as a janitor for 2 years. I mopped floors for 2 years. I changed bedpans and screwed light bulbs in. Did whatever I needed to do to not have to go home to live with mom. I wanted to be on my own. So, sometimes you sacrifice and eventually you get there. But sometimes people don't want to, young people today don't want to I see that they don't want to sacrifice and struggle a bit to get where they need to be. They want it right out of the box. And of course, going to a university that offers you that is probably the course with the least resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So liberal arts colleges had that, were having that problem before the virus, before the pandemic, and now, of course, it's even worse because now they're shut down. You know, I went to a school with 1,000 students. When I was there in the 60s and 70s, 1,000. It's still 1,000. So how does a school with 1,000 students stay afloat? You know, with all the costs they have on, I don't know, 50 or 60 acres of land. I don't know how many acres of land the college is on, but it's a big expense, a lot of fixed costs. How do they stay afloat over a period of a year or two without students coming to college? So it's not going to be easy. If they fold, it's a national tragedy. It really is.
Yeah. Well, I imagine those schools rely quite a bit on alumni donorship.
They do, but there's a limit to how far that can go too. I mean, you know, that's got its limits.
Okay. Well, so we've kind of crossed into economics a little bit here, and one of the most impressive discussions you and I have had is the importance of community college. But before I ask you about that, can you say some words about the skyrocketing costs of higher education today and what's causing that, and what the ramifications are, potential ramifications?
Boy, that's a tough one. I'm not an economist.
Okay.
You may have hit me on an area where I'm not completely conversant. I know that when I went to school in the late 60s, early 70s, it certainly was a smaller proportion of a family budget than it is today. But I also have an article in this book that deals with the financial issues associated with going to college. It's titled Maneuvering Through the Financial Aid Maze. So I highly recommend reading that essay. There are ways to go to college that don't have to break the budget. And clearly community college is one of them. Think about this. You can go to Northern Virginia Community College for probably about $8,000, maybe $9,000 for 2 years, as opposed to going to a large private university like GW, for example, at $65,000 per year. So if you get a degree in sociology or anything, you know, special education or elementary education or physics or, you know, Spanish, and you go to GW, you're spending what, $250,000 for a 4-year degree, with the possibility of being remunerated at about $40,000 or $50,000 a year out of college, as opposed to taking the same classes at the community college for about $400 per course. To me, it's a no-brainer. Why would you go to a place like GW and spend $6,000 for a sociology class, when you can go to the community college and spend $400 for that same class and be in a class with 30 or 35 students, sometimes even less, and a professor who knows your name and who actually cares about you, instead of being in an amphitheater with 400 students paying $6,000 for the same class. To me, there's no question you're going to get a better education at the community college for 2 years. Beyond that, you save all that money, you go to GW, you go to James Madison, you go to UVA, you go to the University of Iowa, wherever you want to go, and then spend that money the last 2 years. And your degree still says James Madison, UVA, University of Iowa, GW. But your proudest degree should be from the community college, where you really got the basis of your education that provided you the foundation for your last 2 years. So that, to me, is one of the simplest ways to address the issue of rising costs of education in America. You know, beyond that, why universities nationwide, why their costs have skyrocketed? People say it's faculty salaries. Faculty would just cringe at that idea because, of course, faculty is not paid a lot of money. We know that. Educators are not paid a lot. People with PhDs are making maybe $100,000 a year. You know, so it's certainly not faculty expenses, but you know, there are a lot of fixed costs going into. On top of that, you and I both know, Anwar, when we were in college, at least when I was in college, facilities were much more modest. We had one cafeteria. Yep. If you were hungry, you wanted to eat, you went to one building. Now you go to James Madison, you can probably pick 10 or 12 or 15 places to go eat on campus. They've got rock climbing things in the gym. They've got, you know, swimming pools. They've got all sorts of things. So colleges and universities have become so competitive with each other that they're trying to one up each other and put more and more and more money into their facilities. Well, somebody has to pay for that, and it's, of course, it's tuition and donors. But we've sort of elevated what it means to go to college and what the expectations are when you go to college. And as long as the expectations are up here instead of down here, then costs are going to continue rising. So maybe we ought to consider two things: send your kid to community college for 2 years, save some money, and demand less of the university you send your kids to the second 2 years, and not expect as much in terms of physical plant. Certainly you do not want to cut faculty salaries, because that's, cutting your nose off to spite your face. Cutting faculty salaries means you're going to get less education for your child. So if you're going to put your money anywhere, put it into faculty salaries, hire the best and brightest that you can possibly get, and go from there. I hope that's a decent answer. I'm not an economist, but those to me are the two issues the two biggest reasons why colleges are getting so expensive and parents are paying more than they need to spend.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that was a great answer. It's a relevant topic. I know in the Democratic primary, Senator Warren was, that's a discussion. We're going to relieve all of the student loan debt, and we're going to, some of these are empty promises, but I think that young people don't understand on the front end the concept of having to pay something back of that magnitude.
Right. They don't understand debt.
Back end.
Yep. Yeah.
So I couldn't imagine having to pay back. I got lucky. I was fortunate. But I can't imagine having to pay back $200,000, $400,000 on the back end.
And no offense to elementary school teachers, because I love K through 12 education and teachers, and I have enormous respect for them, and nurses. They don't get paid a lot of money. If you have that kind of debt that you just mentioned, and you're teaching in an elementary school in, somewhere in Illinois, and you're making $42,000 a year, you got a long haul before you can pay that $100,000 off. So, parents and students need to think ahead. Compare what you plan to do with where you plan to go. If you plan to be a corporate lawyer or a neurosurgeon, and you have the ability to do those things, and you expect to make $500,000 a year, well, maybe going to GW at $65,000 might make sense. Even then, I'd question it. But if you don't have that ability, then I wouldn't go there. So, yeah, there's no doubt about it that incurring debt, students don't understand. And that leads me to another point, too. Public schools in America need to offer financial training, financial education to students. Students need to know how to manage their money when they get out of high school. So when the question of going to college comes up when you're a sophomore or junior in high school, mom and dad are not confronted with the question from their son or daughter, I want to go to Stanford. Don't worry about it, mom or daddy, if you can't afford it. I'll borrow. I'll just borrow money. That topic should never come up. The question coming out of your son or daughter's mouth should be, mom or dad, I want to go to college. What can we afford? I've had some training in finance in high school. I know a little bit about it. I know what your personal finances are to some degree. What can we afford to do to send me to college? What can we afford to do to send me to college? Not what you can afford to pay me to go, or what can I afford to borrow? Those are two wrong questions. Not what parents can afford to pay, or what I should borrow is the wrong way to approach it. What can we afford to do together to make this happen? The most cost-effective and efficient way. But that doesn't happen very often. Because people jump into college thinking that I'll pay anything to get a college degree. I'll pay anything to get my son or daughter through college. I owe it to them.
Yeah.
No, wrong question. When my two sons were getting ready to go to college, my wife and I said to them, you live in Virginia, arguably probably the preeminent state in the country for higher education. You've got lots of schools to pick from. If you go to school in Virginia, we'll pay for your education up to $15,000. After that, you're on your own. You're on your own. You decide. You want to take out loans beyond that? You're on your own. They both went in state. Smart move, right? So, and my younger son went to community college for 2 years. So there are all sorts of ways to control college costs. Whether you're poor, middle class, or wealthy, There are all sorts of ways to control college costs. People just don't think ahead. They plunge into it with irrational thinking and irrational expectations. And then they come out with irrational outcomes 4 years later, and then everybody's in a panic mode. Oh, I owe $100,000. Or, we had to refinance the mortgage and you lost your job. What do we do now? Or our retirement account we borrowed against our IRA or retirement account. Why would anybody borrow against their personal IRA if they're in their 50s or 60s and beyond me to send their kid to college? If you're in your 50s or 60s, you've got 20 or 30 years max to plan for your retirement. If your son or daughter is 21 years old, they've got 40 or 50 years to plan for their retirement. Why are you paying all that money for your kids' education if they've got 40 years and you've got 10 or 15 or 20 years? So people need to think through all of those issues. And I'm going to put a plug in for a friend of mine who's a financial planner who offers a lot of advice in this area. And I'm probably speaking as, I've read a lot of his books, Rick Edelman. Rick Edelman talks about all these things in great detail. I've sent him a copy of my book. He loved it. And he and I talk about these things a lot. So my advice to parents is ramp it down. Make sure your son or daughter understands what they're getting into as they're approaching their college years, and make rational decisions instead of irrational, emotionally laden decisions.
Yeah. Well, yeah, what you just described is huge. A big financial riddle to parents is, do you save for your retirement, or do you hunker down and fund your child's college education? And a lot of parents feel guilty about that,
right.
And they feel like, they owe it to their child at that point to continue their education. So a lot of parents definitely get caught in that quagmire.
And my wife and I are both educators. Denise taught public schools for 35 years. Neither one of us made a lot of money. We're very modest incomes. We did both. We saved, we invested, we lived modestly. Some people would say frugally. And we were able to send both of our kids to state universities, and they came out with no debt. And we were able to save for our retirement. Could we have saved more for our retirement? Probably. Are we comfortable now in retirement? Yes. Do we take big expensive trips? We still don't. So some people can do both. Not many can. And we consider ourselves fortunate.
Okay. I recorded a few videos on the whole relieving and forgiving student loan promises that those promises that Elizabeth Warren was making, and I passed a lot of credit to my mother. There were a couple of schools I wanted to go to, and she looked at the cost of it and said, "No, you can't go because that's going to be a ton of money that
Good for her.
You're going to have to repay."
Good for her.
At
smart mom.
18, 19, again, you just don't understand.
Of course.
On the back end, you're going to have to make a living of your own.
Right.
And once you have all that debt to pay back,
right,
it's going to be very tough sledding.
Yep. And you were in high school, 18 years old, and your friends were all applying to fairly expensive schools that they couldn't afford. And the pressure was on Anwar to stay with his peers.
Yeah.
Right? What was the question back then? Where are you going to school, Anwar? Where are you going to school, Susan? Right? I'm going to UVA. I'm going to Stanford. I'm going to Notre Dame. Oh, you're going to the community college? Really? Right? So it's peer pressure. Again, it's peer pressure and zip code envy, all of which I talk about in this book.
Well, Ralph, the other thing is that they're always, it's a business. Higher education has a business aspect, and they're selling.
Of course it does.
Whenever you watch those football games on Saturdays,
Yep.
The universities are running commercials showing these nice, elaborate advertisements of their schools.
Yep. Exactly.
Hey, I want to go to UVA or the University of Michigan or Notre Dame.
Yep.
Do you feel like
what do they do when they take your kid on a tour of the campus? What do? They show them all the nice things. They show them the cafeteria. They show them all the pretty buildings, and they show them the social activities. They don't tell them about the faculty. They just show them all the stuff that impresses an 18-year-old. They get back in the car. John or Sue says, "Oh my God, Mommy, I love that school. I want to go." Worry about the fact that it costs Mommy and Daddy $60,000 a year. And by the way, getting back to the issue of student loans and forgiving them, I know you're about to ask me this question. I'm going to tell you right now, I don't believe in what Elizabeth Warren is saying. She's nuts. She's crazy. Bad idea. Bad idea. I just don't. It sends the wrong message to people in general that you can borrow money helter-skelter, willy-nilly, and not pay it back. It's a bad message for society. I just don't buy it.
Okay.
Maybe offer community service.
Yeah.
Put in 2 or 3 years of community service, but complete forgiveness of your loans, no. Maybe community service makes sense. As a matter of fact, I think Joe Biden even mentioned the other day about the fact he's proposing the possibility of 2 years of community service out of college and to offset the cost of loans. Great idea. Great idea. Work in a school, volunteer at a school, volunteer at a homeless facility, volunteer at a hospice. Do something, something to serve your community or your country. That to me is the way to, quote, forgive your debt. But to flat out say, you don't owe the money anymore when you were making a mistake from the beginning, no, I don't buy it.
Did you see?
And a lot of people listening to this are going to be appalled by that statement. But I grew up at a time when if you borrowed money, you better pay it back.
Well, yeah, it definitely runs pretty deep. Did you see the clip of that parent in Iowa who confronted her and said, well, I saved up for my children's education. Are you going to pay me back for that?
Yeah, that's another argument.
Of course not.
Yeah, that's another argument. Yeah, it's another argument. And it's a lot of people. Yeah, that's a tough one. It's a very difficult topic.
It is.
And hopefully by the next generation, we won't be having this topic as much because people will make more rational decisions, which goes back to what we were talking about before. If you make more rational decisions at the outset, we shouldn't be having this discussion in 10 or 20 years.
Yeah.
The next generation of kids going to college, at least theoretically, we would hope, come out with less debt, and that question should not face the next set of presidential candidates. Should we forgive student debt? It's sad we even have to ask that question. It's a commentary on the mistakes that were made in the past, just 4 years ago.
Okay. Well, Ralph, I'm listening to all this, and I'm definitely going to have you back because
Mm-hmm.
education is such a broad ocean. But I'm gonna take us out with 2 questions here. One is going to be a little more open-ended, and I want to kind of go back about 20 or 30 years, probably to around the time you started. When I was coming up into middle school and then into high school, I remember that they were predicting. They said your generation is you guys aren't going to stay at one job for 30 years.
Oh, interesting question. Yeah.
And you guys are going to have to be prepared to move around a little bit and change.
Yep.
Like how were they able to predict that back in the 1980s? Was that information coming out in academic journals, or were you all looking at industry trends and seeing that this is what future generations are going to have to do?
When in 1982, I began working for the county board in Fairfax, and I was an aide to a county board member. I eventually became chief of staff, but I was aide to a county board member. I got my first Apple computer, desktop computer. The monitor was about that big, that deep, and it ran on DOS. And all of a sudden, we were using computers, and we were doing this thing called email, which was all new. And this new thing called a fax machine showed up. And instead of having me to mail something to a school board member that my boss needed to get mailed or deliver it from Franconia Road all the way over to the Massey building in downtown Fairfax, I could then go to a telephone and put this piece of paper in a machine and send it to the school board member and have him or her receive it instantaneously. The technology in 1982, between the advent of the personal computer, the PC, and fax machines, transformed the office. And I recall back then they were talking about a paperless office. Well, that never happened, really. We're inching toward that more and more, but it took almost 40 years to achieve what we thought would be a paperless office. And we thought that would happen in the next 5 or 6 or 7 years back then.
Mm-hmm.
So technology changed slowly and incrementally. I'm not sure when the shift happened completely, but it was a slow incremental thing. And I think people didn't realize what was happening until it actually happened. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but it was the whole issue of looking into the future and knowing that jobs would change so rapidly, and people would have to go through career changes every 2 or 3 or 4 years was not really on the horizon in the 80s. It really wasn't even on the horizon when my older son, Raphael, graduated from high school in 2003. I think that whole paradigm shift happened, I want to say 2008 or 10. And I think it was maybe a result of the economic recession of that period. And technology became so pervasive that people suddenly realized that they were more mobile, and they could change jobs because of technology. The other thing that changed it too was and this is important, back in the 1980s was the elimination. Most private employers eliminated private pensions. So pensions went out the window. And people back in the 80s were expected to fund their own retirements. And that's when 401ks came around, right? So 401ks were set up in the 1980s by an obscure economist from, I think, University of Pittsburgh or somewhere in Pennsylvania, who came up with the idea. There was a loophole in the IRS code that said people could they could put money into an account and it would be tax-free. And he researched it and realized it was true, and it exploded from there. And then companies got the idea that instead of guaranteeing people a pension, we will tell them that you'll no longer will get a pension from GM or from Ford or where it happens to be. You will now be offered this 401k where you could fund your own pension. That changed everything. So when people realized that they didn't have to work for the same company for 30 or 40 years to get a retirement, that opened the door to changing. So between technology and the elimination of private pensions, not public pensions, but private pensions, those two things shifted the way people viewed work and how often they can and should change jobs. So the level of loyalty that I had, or that you had, certainly I had when I was younger, doesn't even exist today. My kids expect to change jobs every 2 or 3 years, sometimes less. I think Raphael's had, I don't know, 7 jobs since finishing. Wow. 7 jobs and sort of even almost 7 different career paths since he graduated from GW just 8 or 10 years ago. So those two things I think are critical: changes in retirement options and technology.
Okay, that is fascinating. My dad is a stickler for holding on to that job, and he still tells me today, I recommend you keep that job. But in my mind, we've been taught to always think about something else. Yep. And so I do think about other things, but
it's old thinking. It's old thing. It's old thing. It's like people saying, let's pay off the mortgage and have a mortgage burning party. That's Depression era thinking. People in financial planning know now that one of the best things to do is have a big fat mortgage over a long period of time. That's part of the entire composite of your financial planning picture. So the idea of paying off a mortgage is also somewhat outdated. So the idea of holding onto a job for 20 or 30 years for a pension is outdated because of the way things have changed. And the whole idea of paying off a mortgage, the same thing. So there have been huge shifts in the way society and economics work today. Unfortunately, there's a lag between those shifts and the way people think. And until people begin to think differently, and that lag and that gap permeates or continues, we're going to continue having problems. So your dad, I understand your dad. My mom, the same thing. Everybody who was older than me, people I grew up with, shouldn't have a mortgage. When you enter your retirement years, you shouldn't have a mortgage. Well, there are plenty of people out there in the financial planning world who would say, no. If you've done your financial planning properly, having a mortgage is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
So, that's another topic for another day.
Yeah.
I'm not an economist, but I know a little bit about that stuff.
Well, and I'm going to take us out with technology and going back to what I asked you about predicting changes. Over on my technology channel, I shot a couple of videos on 5G, and in doing the research for that, the way the company, I forget the name of the company, but the way they laid it out, all of this stuff was pre-planned. 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, going back to the 70s and the 80s. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I just think there's something to be said for, these companies that are creating these products for us, they were looking ahead 20, 30 years ago about regarding these technologies. And I think it kind of behooves everyone to just think about as well. Think about where things are going.
Oh yeah.
Look at future trends versus where we came from.
Absolutely.
But I'm going to take us out with technology here. Earlier on, we talked about what you started to notice in terms of your students and how they were interacting and how they were becoming more digital. What do you foresee are some of the dangers of us becoming too digital? Are those students going to have a hard time when they go out into the workforce? Is society in general, in terms of all of us just relating to each other and communicating, is all that in danger of suffering or going away in some way?
Let me just point to a book that I don't have at my fingertips that I read about 2 years ago. It's called, the title of it is The Global Achievement Gap. The Global Achievement Gap, written by Tony Wagner. I recommend that book highly. He looks at what he calls the 7 survival skills that will be required for anybody entering the workforce today and in the future. Those 7 survival skills don't mention technology. They barely even mention science and math.
Wow.
The first thing he mentions is communication skills and oral and written communication skills. And then 6 or 7 other skills that I can't recall at the top of my head. Things like the ability to work in groups, the ability to think out of the box, the ability to think creatively, the ability to have a sense of entrepreneurship. But all the 7 survival skills that he talk about core skills that historically have always been at the basis of people who are successful in life. And he's not saying that science and math and technology and those skills are not important. But what he did was he went around the country and even around the world, interviewed CEOs, high-level executives, and deans and presidents of colleges and universities, very high-level people, and asked them, what do you look for in your students? And what do you look for when you hire somebody? And they all it all boiled down to what this guy, Tony Wagner, in the end said were what he thought were the 7 survival skills necessary for success in today's work world and in the future. And I find that fascinating, that you and I both know, Anwar, that if you can't speak clearly, if you can't write clearly, if you can't interact with people, if you can't do all the things that are based on interpersonal skills at that base level that sociologists talk about, when you talk about symbolic interactionism and dealing with dyads and triads and group behavior, if you're not skilled at dealing in those areas, all the technological skills in the world are not going to promote you. You've got to have both. You've got to have both. So I'm not down on technology. Technology is an important tool. It's an important tool. It can't be the be all and end all. It's an important tool. If you have both, you're destined for success. If you have only technological skills, your future is not as clear and probably not as bright.
Okay. Well said. Well
so said. I'm a firm believer in obtaining an education, not just being trained. It's so important. It's so important.
Okay. Well, as discussed earlier, me and Ralph, we did a QA on my blogging platform regarding the potential dangers of technology, and I'm going to leave that in the description box below in case anyone wants to go read that. Ralph, do you want to show your book one more time and
sure.
People where they can find it? Okay.
It's on Amazon.
Yeah.
It was written, the second edition was done in 2017. It's fairly current. It's got a wide range of topics. It deals with finance. It deals with choosing a college. It deals with a community college as an option. It deals with the digital divide between wealthy and poor. It deals with grit, and I'll leave it at that. Grit.
That's huge.
How important that is. How important that is to people's personal success. My wife and I, Denise, wrote an essay on using drama to the core because she was a theater teacher. It's a wide range of things in here that I think people would find interesting. It's a collection of I'd say about 15 essays that deal with issues in education, K through 12 and higher education. So you can find it on Amazon. So please read it and give me some feedback. And Amor, I appreciate this opportunity. I really do.
Yes, I'm going to leave the link, the Amazon link to Ralph's book in the description box below in case anyone wants to go right to it and purchase a copy. I highly recommend it. Well, Ralph, thank you for coming on this first time, because you have to come back, because there are so many ways that you and I could have gone with this discussion. And once we finish, I'll probably think of some more. I'll think of some things that I should have asked you. So I definitely want you to come back. And
yeah,
please.
And you, as you can see, I get on a roll. So, cut me off when you need to.
Yeah. Well, also, please thank Denise for helping to get us connected here.
Yeah. Well, yeah, she's my techie.
Okay. Well, we're going to stop here. And again, this was. I hope this is as much fun for the viewers as it was for me to do, because individuals like Ralph are definitely and truly resources for the rest of us in terms of experience.
Well, thank you, Anwar, and I appreciate all you've done for me. I know you've mentioned me as a mentor, but you're a close friend and confidant, and it's my honor to help you out. And I'm proud of you for what you're doing with your blog and now with your YouTube channel. Very impressive. Good for you.
All right. Well, we're going to stop here. Everyone,
all right.
Thank you for watching. Please like this video, please share it, and please subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, also for Dr. Perrino as well. And as I always say at the end of my videos, your attitude determines your altitude. Take care, and I will talk to you the next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, my friend. Take care.